Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe now and like this video. Tonight's scary stories are stories sent in by viewers like yourselves. Sit back, relax, stay sinful. Story number 1. My name is Robert and I'm 36 years old, and I have Asperger's syndrome. One thing I've always enjoyed from a young age is camping. As I grew up in Colorado, my grandpa and I would camp mostly in the winter time. I don't know why, but camping in the winter made camping that much more enjoyable. I've traveled quite a bit to do winter camping trips in Minnesota, Alaska, and a few places in Canada. I went on one trip about 2 years ago to Sweden, during winter time, of course. Unfortunately, my camping trip wasn't as wonderful as I had hoped it would be. Since my grandfather died, I usually went camping alone, sometimes with friends and other relatives, but mostly by myself, and that was the way I enjoyed it. When I went to Sweden, I was alone. My trip to Sweden would last 5 days. I have survival skills to cope if I run out of food and water. Also, I'm capable of building a shelter from scratch with whatever nature provides me. This story starts on my second night. I was in a forest covered in snow, and it was lightly snowing as well. I had a small campfire and was cooking some sausages and drinking some coffee I had made from scratch. Then from out of nowhere, a man walked towards me and sat down on the log next to me, put his hands out to warm up in front of the fire. He had no gloves or hat, and from the looks of it only had one coat on. I should say, as someone who has been camping for most of my life, it's not unusual for random people to approach you, ask for food, and sometimes even spend the night under your shelter. This guy looked a little unusual. He looked a little bit shook up, like he was frightened or something. I asked if he was okay and wanted something to eat. He didn't answer me. He just carried on watching his hands warm up against the fire. I poured him a cup of coffee and told him he was welcome to use my tent for shelter for the night. This time he said, "Thank you." The rest of the night may have come across pretty awkward because neither he or I said much, but I'm not much of a talker and it didn't bother me at all. Eventually I went to sleep in my tent, and the stranger went to sleep as well in the spare sleeping bag I had next to me. At some point during the night I woke up, but only for a few moments. All I heard was footsteps crunching in the snow just outside of my tent, and then the noise of the zip to my tent. I thought the guy was going outside to pee or leave, so I didn't give it a second thought, fell back to sleep quickly after. When morning arrived, I woke up to a slight draft, because the tent was left wide open. I didn't mind the guy leaving, but he could have at least closed the tent back up. At this point, I didn't think anything unusual or suspicious. That was until I got out of my tent and saw something in the snow. There was a perimeter of footprints around my tent, all facing the same way, which was my tent. At first, I thought it could have been that guy who camped with me, but there were too many footprints, too many different sizes and treads to be just one man's. This was unusual and I really didn't know what to think. I then thought, I'm not the only one out here camping, obviously, but still the footprints were concerning. I spent the following day hiking, fishing in a nearby river and taking photos of the beautiful wildlife. As nighttime approached, it started snowing quite heavily. It was getting cold and windy, so I started to hike to try and find a nice spot to set up camp. I didn't need to, as surprisingly I came across a cabin on top of a hill. I approached the cabin and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. I knocked once more and still nobody answered. I took a look through the window. The cabin looked old and abandoned, so I tried the door handle, and it opened right up. I thought I would take shelter there for one night, as I thought a storm was approaching. Before setting up my things, I naturally took a look around the place. Like I said, the place seemed old and abandoned, but somehow it looked like someone was still living there, because when I walked into the next room, there was a little kitchen area. There was a small fire dying out, and a table next to it had mugs of stale beer. I didn't feel comfortable with staying in there knowing that someone may return at some point. As I was leaving the kitchen area, I stumbled over something I hadn't noticed before. I looked down and saw it to be a coat that was blue. I'm pretty sure it was the same one as the man who camped with me. I thought maybe he owned the cabin. That wasn't until I turned the coat around, saw a large slash in the back, with red stains all around it. This frightened me. I dropped the coat and quickly ran outside the cabin, started heading back down the hill. My timing couldn't have been better, because at that point I heard a group of men talking. I hid behind a tree and watched over at the cabin. I saw 7 large men talking, and 2 of whom were carrying sacks of something over their shoulders. Once the men were inside, I carried on heading down the hill and away from the area. I didn't want to camp anymore, as there was a group of men in these woods who could potentially harm me. I came across a ski lodge and told one of the staff members to call the police. Annoyingly, the police said they would be coming in the morning. I checked into the lodge for one night. I got around an hour of sleep that night thinking about what those men were carrying in those bags, and what could have happened to that guy, and even myself if they found me in their cabin. In the morning, I told the police everything that happened and what I found, telling him that the man who camped with me was possibly killed or badly injured. I had spent the whole day in the lodge waiting for the police to get back to me. All they said was that they found the men in the cabin, questioned them, but there was no evidence of my claim. I was kicking myself at that point, wishing I had brought the coat with me. The police told me there was nothing that they could do, which was very upsetting to hear. I had enough and went home. I didn't let this experience ruin winter camping for me. However, I am much more cautious. Carry a firearm. Story number 2. My name is Jonas. I'm a 34-year-old truck driver who lives about 5 miles outside of Berlin. This is a very dark and graphic story, and I'm lucky to be alive to tell it. As I mentioned, I'm a truck driver. I drive all across Europe making deliveries to and from Germany. I was doing a cold and rainy night shift driving through Poland. It's about 2 or 3 in the morning. I can't remember exactly. I was feeling tired and hungry. After a couple more miles of driving, I came across a small diner, so I stopped to get something to eat. When I pulled up there were about 2 other cars in the lot, I assumed to be staff members. When I walked inside, there was no one around. Even after I walked up to the cafeteria, I still couldn't see any staff members. After a few minutes of waiting, a man said hello from behind me in the seating area. He was a large man, very fat and had a shaved head and a shaved face, was wearing a gray tracksuit. At first I thought he was just saying hello, but then he went around the counter and asked how he could help. It was weird because he didn't look like he worked here. Anyway, I asked for steak with French fries and a cappuccino. He said okay and walked off to prepare my food. I went and sat down to scroll on my phone as I waited. Shortly after, the guy in the tracksuit came back with my food. He gave me a raw, undercooked steak and almost still frozen French fries with a half cup of black coffee. I was too annoyed and too tired to care and change my order. I drank the coffee and went to the bathroom before I headed back on the road. This was when I made a horrifying discovery. In the bathroom, there was 2 urinals in one stall. I tried opening the stall door, but it was slightly blocked. I pushed harder until I forced it open. And what I saw was a man dead on the floor, with his head on the toilet seat. He had his head and face smashed in. One of his eyeballs were hanging out. There was another man behind the toilet, dead on the floor, with a cable cord wrapped around his throat, blood streaming down his eyes. They were both wearing aprons, so it was obvious they worked here. At that point, it hit me like a truck what was going on. That man in the gray tracksuit brutally murdered these two men, still out there in the diner posing as an employee. At that point, I really thought I was going to die. I had to think quickly on my feet. I thought for all he knows I had left the diner. He doesn't know I'm in here. My plan was to burst out the bathroom door and run outside back to my truck. I ran out of the bathroom and turned to head towards the exit. The thing was, the killer was there looking around outside, I guess to see where I went. I then turned around and ran towards the end of the diner towards the fire escape. When I got to the fire escape, it was locked. I didn't need a key, it just needed to have the bolts reopened from the top of the door to the bottom. I turned around and saw the man running towards me. I was running as fast as I could to get that door opened. I managed to open the door, but as soon as I started to leave and run out, I felt a sharp jab in my shoulder, along with the collar of my shirt being pulled. I could hear my shirt stretch and rip. I pulled away from the guy as hard as I could. He slashed my arm with the knife he was holding, so I was trying to get him off of me. I ran straight to my truck with the man still pursuing me. Once inside, I locked my doors and started the truck. The man ran to my truck, started pulling on my doors. He then smashed my window. But thankfully at that point the truck was on, and I was pulling away. As I was driving, I got my phone and called the police. I told them what happened and where I was heading. Thankfully, there was a patrol at a close-by gas station. They said to meet the police there, and another patrol would go to the diner where the killer was. I got to the gas station and met up with the police officer. First thing he wanted to do, however, was look at my wounds, because my arm was visibly bleeding. Then I felt a lot of pain coming from my shoulder. I had actually been stabbed as I was running out of the diner and was bleeding profusely. I fell to the floor at that point, but I was still conscious. The police officer called for an ambulance. Thankfully, the knife wounds weren't too serious. Once the ambulance arrived, the medic tended my wounds while I was talking to the police officers. As I was telling them, the other patrol radioed in, saying they had discovered the bodies, but the suspected killer had fled the scene. Fast forward a few hours of being in the hospital and talking to police officers. I gave them my contact info and headed home. I was fine enough to drive my truck back, and my work was understanding, of course. This story happened about a year and a half ago, and to this day I still haven't received any information about the killer. As far as I know, he still hasn't been caught. I thank God that when the man checked to see where I was, he didn't look in the bathroom first. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here telling this story. Story number 3. The summer after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. I spent that night at the beach watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, no light pollution, I got to my car and started driving down the highway, M22. After 10 seconds of being at speed, there was an older Tahoe, late 90s, that started riding my ass and flashing its high beams. So I got up to about 60 in a 45. They were still on my ass. I pulled off to the side of the road that my parents' cabin is off, and they took the same turn. I thought this seemed weird because there's only 30 to 40 houses on this road. I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end, but leads to a maintenance area for the golf course nearby. The truck was still following me. At this point, I was freaking out because if I pulled into the house, they know where we lived, and they were still following close by. I took a ton of random turns. The truck kept following me every turn for 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic, going through the intersection that gave me a few seconds of a head start. I pulled down a side street, went up 100 yards, turned off all of my lights and waited. The truck slowly drove by the perpendicular street and kept going. Booking it home, pulled my car around the side away from the main road, and I pulled every curtain in the house. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as hell that night. Story number 4. We were living with my brother-in-law and his 2 teens when I was pregnant. He has an elevated house on quite a bit of former hunting land, several miles down a county road. My husband works 7 to 6 a.m., and Bill works offshore for 14 days. While he was at work, his kids stayed with their grandmother. It was a nice house, but it had a weird vibe. I chalked it up to pregnancy hormones. One day, home alone, I was taking a shower and felt someone staring at me. Stuck my head out and listened. I couldn't hear anyone in the house, so I resumed my shower. A while later, I heard the back door shut. I was standing in the kitchen. I could see the door, which had no steps and was 6 feet from the ground. The door was still locked. I told my husband about it that night and he shrugged it off. We locked down and went to bed. I don't know how long I'd been asleep, but I woke up to the blankets being yanked off the bed, my husband flipping on every light in the house. He threw open every door, every cabinet, looked in every pantry or closet while holding his gun. I asked what was going on and he swore he heard boots thumping through the house, and someone talking. Everything was still locked and it's not a big house. Nobody was there except us. One night a while later, my niece came into our room. Her dad worked over and we had them for a few days, asked to sleep in bed with us. Now, this girl isn't scared of anything and is 14 at the time. I sat up, told my husband to scoot over, and I patted my pillow. That's when I noticed her 16-year-old brother curled up under a blanket on the floor beside me. "Why are you both in our room at 2 a.m? They didn't want to answer at first, but explained that something in my niece's room laughs at night. I hated that room when we moved in and put up any laundry I did quickly in there. I asked my nephew why he was on the floor and he said, "She came into my room on the cot to sleep, but something started knocking on the door. We came down here as soon as it stopped." Again, my husband flipped on every light, looked in every nook and cranny. Nothing. Eventually we moved out and the kids decided to live full-time with Grandma. My husband said he heard a man laughing in my niece's room. There was nobody there when he turned on the lights. Scared the shit out of him. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a like, comment, and share this video. Email all of your true scary stories to thesinfulsavant@gmail.com. I will leave a link to my email in the description box below. Till we meet again, stay sinful.